Hey guys, so I mentioned in the last video that I was going to replace the hard-coded string I was passing for the origin for the cores to environment variable. So I went ahead and did that, added it to the .env file, and I'm now using frontend host is the name I gave it. So now in development this will be equal to localhost, and then when we move this to production we'll do whatever the production string is and just change that environment variable. Alright, so the other thing that we need to change from last video was the tests that were failing. So at first I thought it had to do with Redis because that's really the only thing we added. But I went ahead and ran the tests again and they seem to all pass. So this is like a sporadic error that sometimes pops up, sometimes doesn't. And I actually think it has to do with the connection, so connecting to the PostgreSQL database. And what I think is causing it is we're not closing the connection for typeorm, at least in two of the files, register and the login test. I was doing it for this one and I just forgot to do it for register and login. So I'm gonna go ahead and change that. So we're gonna have a connection handle and we're gonna do it in the same way we did for the other one, and then we're just gonna get access to the connection, and then after all the tests have run we're gonna just close it. So connection.close. And we are going to copy this and just move it to login over here and just re-import connection. Alright, and we'll let these tests rerun. I don't know, it looks like this one took a really long time to run, and we are getting, so this is, I think this is the exact error that we were getting last time. I talked about query failed duplicate key. So I think this is the one I'm talking about. I think it's a Postgres error, not a Redis error, even though it's failing the Redis test. And I'm going to just restart the tests. Now that we're closing the connections, everything should be closed and should be able to restart okay. It's taking a little bit longer to run. Okay, interesting. So the relation users does not exist. So this just means that the database is not up. I'm curious what's going on here because we're resetting the database and synchronizing it every time. I don't know if we're just running it too fast or something and we have a race condition in here. I'll just try running this again. And there we go, all the tests worked. Let's run it again one more time. So we probably have a race condition in here somewhere. I'm not quite sure what it is. For now I'll leave it because it seems to work most of the time. And I want to move on to the topic that I want to cover today, and that is creating kind of some middleware for GraphQL. And we can just close this test, and the reason for that is we have in our login resolver, we're now setting the user ID for this session. So now we can set up kind of a system for permissions. So maybe I want to allow someone to only access something if they're logged in, or maybe if that user is an admin or something. So we want to add a way so we can run some code before our resolver runs to check whether the user is the correct user. And I wasn't sure exactly how I wanted to do this. I had done it before, but I felt like the way I did it was too complicated and I wanted to simplify how I did it. And the first thing that I was considering was schema directives. And the way these work is you actually add something to your schema. So here's an example right here. We can see there's a type of person and he adds a schema directive rename to it. And this code runs and it can do pretty much anything to the resolver result, and then also to basically the context, the arguments passed in. It can manipulate all that stuff. The one thing, there's really two things that held me back from using this. The first is I never saw any examples where they were using multiple directives. Like maybe they use a rename directive and then they also use, for example, an auth directive, and I kind of wanted this middleware to stack so I could use multiple and kind of reuse the middleware all over the place. And secondly, I didn't really like adding it to my schema. So even if I could stack the middleware, I didn't like having to add it to my schema. I preferred just like having this logic in the resolver itself and keeping the schema clean from this. So I moved to a different solution, and I was looking at how GraphQL did it with GraphQL Middleware, and I thought this was a decent idea of how they did it. But the way they did it is they basically set up a whole new schema that they use for middleware that runs before the old schema. While I liked how they set up their middleware, I felt like it was unnecessary, in that we could just create a simple function that does something very similar to this. So what I'm going to do is create a new query called me, and it gets the current user. And we're going to add some middleware to it. And what I want this middleware to do is to check if the user is logged in or not. And so the way we're going to do this is I'm basically going to have a function like so. And we're going to pass one of the parameters as resolve. And what resolve does is it'll just go ahead and this is going to be like the resolver for our actual code. And we can just run things before we actually call this resolver itself. And this will make more sense when we actually do it with our own code. So let's go ahead and get started with this. So I guess the first thing I'm going to do is create a module. I'm going to call it me. And this is really just kind of like a test module. And I'm going to create, and I guess we can copy over the schema. So for this, don't need a mutation. I just want a single query called me, and it returns a user. So type user, and it's going to have an ID and an email. And that's pretty much the only fields I want to pass back to the user. I don't really want to tell them if they're confirmed or not, or what their hashed password is. We can copy resolvers as well, paste that in, and we can get rid of the whole mutation bit. And we don't need this error response or any of that stuff right now. So it's just going to be me, and we need to run some code before it to make sure they're logged in. But we have a parent, which we don't care about, arguments, which we don't care about, and the third parameter is context, which we do need the session, because from the session we can get the user ID. So we can say user.find1, and we're going to say where the ID is equal to session.userID. Okay, so if we ran this code right now, and we tried to query me without being logged in, it would just return null. But maybe instead I would want to, for example, throw an error or do something else if the user is not logged in and trying to access this query. So I'm going to create a file which I'm going to call middleware.typescript. And we're going to export const middleware, or I should really we'll just export default function from this. And this is going to be an asynchronous function. So it's going to take the resolver. So this parameter here is going to be this. And then it's going to take all the other arguments. So it's going to have parent, args, context, and then also info. And this is going to be of type any, and then the resolver is going to be of the type resolver, which I think, do we have a type for that already? We don't, so I'm going to create a type right here called export type resolver, and it's going to be this function right here. And we'll put that back here. So resolver, and we'll let this prettify. So a resolver is a function that has these parameters here and then returns anything. So then my middleware, this is going to be a resolver. Perfect. Okay, so what I want to do is, so this is going to be where I put my middleware. Then I can call my resolver. So resolver, and I can pass in pretty much anything in here. I could take parent, args, context, info. So I could just pass in those four because that's what it expects. Or maybe I pass in, for example, something else. Like I want to modify the context. So I'm like, alright, we'll keep the context, and maybe I'll pass in logged in is true, or whatever field I want. For now, we'll just do this. Oops. Pass in context. And then afterwards, we can run afterware. And then we can return result. So this is how basically this function is going to work. It's going to take the resolver as one of the parameters. Then it can do anything before that it wants, anything after that it wants, and then it's just going to return pretty much whatever we want. And let's do this with a practical example. So what I could do for this, and what I'm going to do is create a higher order function that handles all this stuff. So I'm going to say create middleware.typescript export const create middleware. So this is going to take two parameters. The first is the middleware function, and the second is the resolver function. So our middleware function is this thing. The resolver function is this thing right here. And what we're going to do with that is return a regular resolver. So we're going to return, so a regular resolver would have parent, arguments, context, info. And what I want to return, and let's drop this to a new line. What I'd like to return from this is the middleware function. And the middleware function will take the resolver function as its first parameter, and then the parent, args, context, info. And let's save that. And that's it. That's what all my create middleware function is going to do. So it's a higher order function that takes two things, the middleware function and the resolver function, and we just need to add types for all of this. And then it's going to return a regular resolver. So this is a regular resolver. And the regular resolver is just going to return the middleware. And parent can be anything. All of these can be anything. So the resolver function is going to be a resolver. And let's go back to GraphQL. Export type middleware function. We'll say GraphQL middleware function. And it's going to have basically all these same parameters. So, yep, all these same parameters. Oh, I didn't copy that well. Go back. Yeah. And the only difference is this first one is going to be a resolver. Okay, so that's the type GraphQL middleware function. So what I'm going to do is here's my middleware, and then in my resolver I'm going to say create middleware, and the first function is going to be my middleware, so we'll grab middleware, and our second is going to be our regular resolver. Okay, so we basically are just wrapping this with create middleware, and there's a lot of different ways I can do this. I don't know if this is the cleanest way to do this, but all I want to do is have this function here run before, basically, oops, this function has access to the resolver and can do whatever it wants. The other way I could have done this possibly, and maybe this is a better way to do it. Actually, no, I don't think this is better. I think this is fine. This is probably, let me know in the comments below if you guys think of a cleaner way or a simpler way to do this. But we have our resolver here as our second parameter and our middleware as the first one. Okay, so now I can do whatever I want with this beforehand. Now before I actually do this, I want to create a test so we can make sure all this stuff works. So I'm going to say me.test.ts. And for this, we're going to need to log in to actually get the session. And I was going to use what we use for, like, for example, login, which is this request from GraphQL request. But I couldn't really get it to work very well with cookies. So we're going to be using a different library called Axios. So I'm going to do yarn add Axios. And for those of you that are not familiar with Axios, it is just a request library, and it just happens to work well with cookies. So I'm going to import Axios from Axios. And I guess it's written in TypeScript because I didn't have to install any types for it. So that was nice. Or at least it's bundled with some kind of TypeScript types. So here's going to be my test. And we're going to say async. Okay, so what am I testing here? We'll test me query. And really I should say describe the me query. And we could just call it me. And we don't need to have it async because there's two tests that I want to do. So I guess the first one is for can't. I guess we want an error to be thrown. So can't get user if not logged in. Alright, so we want to basically have an error thrown at us in some case, I guess, in this case, or we could just have null returned. But this is whenever we make a query and the user is not logged in. And we'll handle this case in a second, so we'll do this later. The case that I really care about is that we're able to get the current user. So get current user. Alright, so first things first, I need to log in, and then I'll try to get my user. Now, to log in, there has to exist a user. So we're going to copy our register. And actually, not a register, I like this guy better, where we create a user. Copy all this, and we'll paste it in our test. And so all I want to do here is to create a user that we can use. And we don't need Redis, and I don't really need a user ID. So let's import all these things. And I'm going to say const email and const password, because we're going to be using this in different places. And same thing for password. And then I'm going to say confirmed is true. And did I just, what did I do wrong? Oh, there we go. So I'm going to say confirmed true so we don't have to confirm him. We don't care about setting the user ID here. And there's one problem with this right now. We're not hashing the password. And we could do this in two different ways. We could either just hash the password when we create the user here, or we can add a before insert hook to our entity. And I kind of want to do that because I think that'll save us some coding. So I'm going to say before insert, and I guess we'll just add our function. I'll call it hash password. And we're going to say self.password. Or sorry, not self, that's Python, this.password. And here we're just going to hash the password. And we're just going to use the same logic that we do in our register. So if we go to resolvers, we can see ourselves hashing the password here. And we can copy that and back to our entity. And we need to make this async. So we just need to import bcrypt. So import bcrypt from bcrypt.js. Alright, so now every time we insert a user, before we insert it, we are going to hash the password. So now in our register resolver over here, we don't actually need to hash the password, and I can just get rid of that. Typearm will just handle that for us. And now in our login over here, in our login or me test, I don't have to actually hash the password, it'll get handled for us. So step 1, logging in, because we already have a user now. So I'm going to say Axios, and I'm going to await this. Axios we're going to make a post request. First is our URL, which is the same as always, so test host as string. Second is our data. So here you can pass in our query. So this is your GraphQL query that you want to run. And for us, we want to run the login one. So I'm going to just copy the login code from our test over here. Oops. And back here, paste it in, and call it. Passing our email and password that we use to create a user. And then lastly, I'm going to say with credentials true. This is an important one. This is what will save the cookie. So Axios is going to automatically save the cookie for us. After that, we are just going to make a request to access the user. And I'm just going to console log this for you guys so you can see what the response looks like. So axios.post. And first, same thing as always, pass in the test host as a string. Secondly, our query, and here is just going to be our me query, which we have not written yet. We'll do that now. So const me query. We'll say me, ID, email are the two fields we want to grab. So we'll pass that in, and then lastly, with credentials true, this will pass the cookies that we got here into this post request. Yeah, so let's see what that does. I'm going to comment this out. We should just get a regular user back. And you know what? I'm going to not just wrap this whole thing. I'm going to say const response, and then I'll console.log the response. Okay, and then in our middleware, we're just returning whatever the resolver returns. So we should just get a user back. We'll run a test, and we'll see which test gets run. I don't know if it's going to run all of them or if it's just going to run this single one. And we just need to... It's mad at us because we left a variable that we're not using. There we go. Compiling. Oh, we might actually have one other problem, and that is cores, because expecting we can only do cores for this guy right here. So we'll see what we get back. If we get a problem, we're going to change the origin here. So okay, cool. It does go ahead and fail, so we get this cross origin null forbidden. So if you get this thing, that's a problem with cores. So we're going to say process.env nodeenv, and if we're currently testing, so we're checking the environment, we're testing, we're going to do a star. And what star does is that allows any origin in, whereas this only allows that origin. So only the front end can make requests. Now anyone can make requests with this. And we just have to restart the whole test because it doesn't read the changes that I made, because this is a setup, is when we start the server. Alright. Okay, cool. So it's only running 2 of these tests. Alright, so looks like our register one is failing. I bet if we run them all again, it'll pass. But here's the response. And we get me, which is equal to null. So we actually have some problem here. We would expect to get something back. So how I'm going to debug this is in our register resolvers over here. Sorry, not register, our me. We are just going to console log session.userid and see what we get. So cool. So we're only running the me test. That's perfect. And Okay, so we are indeed getting an object back now. Not sure what was happening before that we weren't getting an object and now we are. I don't know if the code just didn't recompile or something. So in my test, I believe that was the body. Hopefully it'll show us. I think I just need to get the body. So dot data data. So data dot data. Refresh. So it's also running the login tests. And the login failed. But here we can see we currently get Bob, which is nice, and we get this ID, perfect. So at the bottom here it says watch usage. I can just specify W and I can specify the exact test that I want to run. So I don't want to be running all these different tests while I'm doing this. So I'm just going to type me to only run the me one. And it still ran the other test. That's really weird. And we're also getting null now and this other thing. Did I close the connection up here? I'm even closing the connection. Oh, we don't need to we can get rid of this. So it looks like we're getting quite a few errors now. And my regular expression is not working because I only wanted to run the me test. And now it's working. So filter, oh yeah, filter by file name or by test name. I wanted to do file name. So I want me.test.ts. Perfect. Okay, so I don't know why this works sometimes and why it fails sometimes and why we randomly get connection errors and sometimes don't. It's kind of weird, but we're getting this, and this is exactly what I wanted to check and make sure that we get. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to expect it. Expect response dot data dot data and dot me dot email to be or to equal and the email that we have above. So we could also check against the ID, and actually I guess that makes more sense. So I was thinking like we don't know the ID, but we actually could get the ID up here when we create the user. I could say let user ID string, and we can just pass in the ID right there. So then down here we could actually do the whole shape. So it's going to be me, and inside of me we'll have an ID, which is the user ID, and an email. And nice, so we pass now. We don't need to console log this. So really we're just expecting here that we get the data that we should get back. And this video is getting quite long, and I haven't actually kind of delved into how the middleware is going to work or done anything with the middleware. This actually video turned out more to be how to actually, one, test things using cookies, and two, in our resolver over here, how to use the session to get the current user ID and to get the current user who's actually making a request. Because notice here it actually knows who I am, right? In this test over here, just based off, I didn't specify who I was when I made this post request, right? It's looking at the credential or my cookie, and it can tell me what my ID and my email is. So we can look up users and do stuff. So alright, what we'll do in the next video is I'll talk more about how you might use this middleware.typescript. And then also I'm curious what you guys think, or if you guys have done GraphQL Middleware before, how you use it, and what your setup looks like. So that's it for this video, guys. I'll see you tomorrow.